Small opera, big voice. The role of small opera companies in eliminating elitism in the 21st century opera ecology by Cindy Sadler. In the United States, small opera companies are the veins that carry fresh blood throughout the American opera world, and their work benefits both their communities and the American opera ecology at large. Grassroots and experimental opera organizations are pivotal to eliminating elitism in the 21st century opera ecology. In 2022, opera business as usual, that is, business as it was prior to the 2000s, no longer works. Small opera companies have managed to mitigate some challenges particularly well. Today, we're going to look at what these challenges are, how we got here, and what we can do about it. But first, a few definitions. Opera America, the primary advocacy organization in the US, has established a set of tiers that define opera companies by their budgets. We are primarily concerned with the Tier 4 and Tier 5 budget companies, that is, companies with budgets of less than $1 million. We'll also be considering grassroots opera companies. Those are small companies whose missions are closely tied to the community values, and experimental opera companies, small companies that specialize in contemporary opera and or reimagined forms and presentations of inherited repertoire. Before we look at today, let's look back at opera's history in the US. Opera in early America was not especially elitist. It was considered a sophisticated art form, but one that anyone could enjoy and anyone could attend, even people of color, although they were relegated to segregated seating and sometimes even separate entrances. Opera was brought to the US in the 1700s by immigrants for whom it represented an important cultural treasure from home. It was something precious that they wanted to have with them in the New World. And opera spread west with Western expansion. It was a point of civic pride to have an opera house where traveling entertainment of all kinds came, including the most famous singers and opera troupes and other acts of the day. As we moved into the age of recording, radio, television, and film, opera was well represented in all those mediums, and opera companies continued to spring up from the 1970s through the early 2000s. So when did opera become elite? Well, it started as soon as opera hit the shores of the US, and it took some time, but it was slow and steady. And it's not a surprising story at all. Wealthy folks wanted exclusive theaters. They started to charge higher ticket prices. They started to do segregation in the seating, instituted a fancy dress code, which came to be eventually the norm for going to opera. Even today, people feel like you have to dress up to go to the opera. We also had a very deliberate advertising effort to position opera as a luxury product, with stars advertising everything from cigarettes to furs to Rolex watches. So now in the 2000s, opera has easily been positioned as a luxury product. There has been a slow but steady decline in funding for arts education in the schools. The tours that were so popular throughout the 1800s and even up through the late 90s have been cut because they're too expensive. Audiences who grew up attending opera are getting older, and their children aren't as dedicated to donating or buying tickets as their parents were. And then we started to have all these disasters. Enron, 9/11, the 2008-2009 recession where we lost 3 Tier 1 and 2 companies, and of course the pandemic. Last but not least, society is now calling opera out on its entrenchment and slowness to change. Society is demanding better. What we did not lose during the past 2 decades were large numbers of small companies. In the early 2000s, small opera companies have continued to spring up. In 2022, the majority of opera companies in the US are small. So what can we learn from this? opera, and especially big opera, is suffering for its past practices, and it's slow to make real progress in overcoming its challenges. However, this is where we see leadership in the small companies and where big companies can learn from them. Opera leadership in 2022 is still overwhelmingly white and male. However, as we look at smaller companies, we see greater leadership from women and from people of color. If you look at this survey of Opera America membership companies, you can see that of the 11 Tier 1 companies, 73% are run by white male general directors. But as you progress down through the chart, that number drops, percentage rather, drops significantly, and we see much more leadership from people of color and from women in general. So that tells us that small opera companies are taking a leading role in diversity and leadership. Are opera companies systemically racist? The arts marketing firm LaPlaca Cohen did a couple of surveys called Culture Track, and the phase 2 of Culture Track found that more than 50% of people of color, 35% of Hispanics, 20% of whites, and 18% indigenous peoples find that opera companies are systemically racist. Furthermore, over 50% of people of color highly value having local arts and culture venues that reflect their respective cultural identities. This is an important statistic because we're always looking for new audiences and we're always saying that we serve the community. But if a company continues to center inherited repertoire without addressing its problems, what community is that company claiming? Now, there are lots of advantages to being a larger company, and there are advantages to being smaller. Let's compare the two. Big companies perform or tend to perform in temples of art, which create perceptual and physical barriers to attendance for some audiences. For new audiences, audiences are not accustomed to coming to places like this. The fancy appearance, the location, which tends to be in a special arts district or a downtown area that can be somewhat difficult to get to due to traffic or parking, and the expense of parking or the lack of good public transportation that stops close enough for it to be safe or convenient to walk there. There may be few restaurants or affordable food nearby. These can all be barriers to attendance for somebody who is a new attendee. Small companies perform in familiar multi-use spaces or small civic theaters, and they tend to be in the hearts of a variety of communities. Performance spaces are often in familiar areas with a wider variety of amenities at a wider variety of price points. With big companies, these new audiences may not know what is expected of them in these unfamiliar spaces. We know that dress is a barrier to attendance. Many people feel that they don't know how to dress or they don't have the appropriate clothing. They may not know how to behave. They may not feel that they'll understand the program, especially if it's going to be in a foreign language. And harking back to those figures from LaPlaca Cohen, will they be treated well by staff and other patrons? They may have already had bad experiences in similar spaces. It's harder to create personal relationships with single or occasional ticket buyers in a big company. And the best seats are very expensive and go to subscribers and big donors. In smaller companies, new audiences are already familiar with the types of spaces and people that they see utilizing these spaces. They're close to home or to a neighborhood that is similar to their home and in their comfort zone. And more personal, smaller audiences means that it's a greater opportunity to greet and build relationships with all audience members and not just the subscribers and donors. If you're a small company, you know when somebody new walks through the door. And finally, these intimate performance spaces allow everyone to be close to the stage and enjoy the full power of the human voice. Big companies also face challenges from their boards, donors, and audiences, which can tend to be quite conservative, and in presenting contemporary or experimental repertoire. Experiments are risky and expensive for opera companies. So you can see why, especially during fraught times, as we've been in with the pandemic, people are reluctant to take chances. Um, One way that we often try to approach uh, new audiences is by trying to appeal to identity groups, but a lot of care has to be taken when we do that programming. And for big companies, it's easy to say, oh, we're going to do a gay opera, we're going to do a black opera. And then if they don't follow through with those communities and really work at forming relationships, that risk that they took has not only not paid off, but it could be damaging in the future. Small opera companies tend to have more adventurous boards and audiences and their missions that include a non traditional approach to inherited repertoire or even a mandate for contemporary or unusual repertoire. And their organizational flexibility can help them be able to experiment more. If they are doing identity works, chances are they have made identity groups welcome at the table already through online programming and casting policies. So, what can big companies learn? They can review small opera companies' mission statements, value statements, and programming to see how they reflect community values and needs. They can work harder to have leadership and staff reflect the diversity seen in the community. They can study small opera company techniques for attracting non-traditional audiences. They can regularly schedule main stage programming in smaller neighborhood venues. They can support and celebrate local artists who are part of the community. And they can embrace more adventurous programming, even if it must be done slowly over time. Finally, collaborate with smaller companies. There's a lot of benefit to be had there for both sides. In conclusion, encompassing music, poetry, art, architecture, fashion, lighting, dance, literature, acting, and so many other disciplines, opera can and should be for everybody. Without throwing out all that makes opera grand, the American opera industry can look to small opera companies' history, nature, and practices for inspiration to eliminate elitism and create a more egalitarian, community centered, and appealing artistic product. Thank you.